Alright guys, how's it going? Today I'm taking a look at AMD's second generation Ryzen desktop processor reviews. I wasn't part of the official launch, so instead I've decided to take a look at some of the more interesting reviews and articles. Before I get to those, let's take a look at some of the more interesting slides for a little bit of context. Now straight up we see that Ryzen changed high-end computing in 2017, and a couple of slides later we see what they mean by that. The Ryzen effect on desktop and in mobile had an interesting blue line where we see 10 years of quad core for desktops. Now I've mentioned this quite a few times and how much I hate quad cores. 2008 I had my Q6600. It was a great CPU, it really was, but since then around about here I had a 2500K, and then I had a 3570, and then I had a 6700K around here. 10 years of quad core for desktop, and that included me. But after Ryzen and its 8 cores launched in early 2017, we see that this blue line has suddenly moved on to 6 cores instead of quads. We've also seen something similar in mobile. Now it should be said here that this is just marketing. Obviously Intel had long since planned the move to 6-core CPUs with Coffee Lake, way before Ryzen launched. But what's important here is, those 6 cores that you get for less than $200, you would never have got that had it not been for the launch of Ryzen last year. Your 8700Ks would be well over $400, and those i5-8400s, I'm pretty sure those would have been around $250 rather than sub 190. So this is the Ryzen effect, and there's no question that Ryzen has changed the desktop for the better for all of us. Now next up we see the 2018 Ryzen CPU rollout. We've already started with these thinning lights, and then we got the desktop versions. These are your quad cores with the Radeon Vega graphics. 2200G, 2400G, very popular CPUs at a pretty good price. And the ones we're covering today, the second generation, is the first 12nm Zen Plus processors. You're going to get your Ryzen Pro Mobile with Vega graphics. These are exactly the same as all this stuff here, just validated for business use. And then later on we'll get the second generation Ryzen Pro processors, which is basically these ones today, again validated for business desktops. Don't know what this more performance means, unless they're suggesting they have better binned parts. I'd be surprised about that though. This is in the second half of this year, and also in the second half of the year, the second generation Ryzen Threadripper CPUs. Again, all of this will be based on the same 12nm CPUs we see today, and these will for sure be the very best parts. So we've known this for quite a while now, but this second generation Ryzen is all about a doubling down. It's an improvement in what we got last year. Very much an evolution and nowhere near a revolution. That revolution is likely to come in 2019. Now moving on, we see the second generation has higher clock speeds. They're calling it the Zen Plus architecture. Important to note, it is AMD's first 12nm processor, and they're also bullet pointing Precision Boost 2, which is quite an important one I feel, and also lower latencies. There are 4 chips launching today, 2 Ryzen 7s and 2 Ryzen 5s. The best news out of all of this I can see is that there are no quad cores, and hopefully we won't see any more. But the flagship is a Ryzen 7 2700X, with the Ryzen 7 2700 coming below that. Both of those are of course 8-core 16-thread CPUs, and we see the difference in the clock speeds. That's a 4.3 boost with a 3.7 GHz base clock when all threads are loaded, 4.1 and 3.2, and similar to what we saw last year with the R7 1700. Looking at the prices here, $30 difference, and you also get the newer Wraith Prism cooler with the 2700X. I mean, I think last year it was safe to say that the R7 1700 was the part to get. Looking at these prices, only $30 difference and a better cooler, the 2700X looks like a no-brainer to me. Of course, all of these parts are overclockable though, so that one really is up to you. Looking at the R5s, the 2600X and the R5 2600s. Again, the 2600X looks pretty compelling. Last year, the R5 1600, that was the one to get really, and just overclock it. But now with a difference of $30, you're definitely getting better quality silicon with these X chips. For the sake of $30 and a better cooler, the X's now look like the ones to get. Now these are AMD slides of course, so take with a grain of salt. But AMD now claims their gaming performance at 1440p. Over 12 games, they're now only 1% behind the i7 8700K. And with 2 extra cores, as you may expect, they are far further ahead when it comes to content creation. Now I must admit to having a bit of a laugh at this one. This is actually pretty good marketing. You've got this great looking shiny CPU over here with the included cooler, and the colourful side where you've got this kind of depressing looking grey Intel i7 8700K, and it basically just spells it out. Both CPUs offer great gaming performance, but the 2700X is better in content creation, cheaper, and comes with a much better cooler. So again, this is pretty good marketing. Now a bit later on we get to see some of the architecture details. An increase of around 3% higher one-thread IPC. 3%, it's not anything to lose your mind over. However, given that they were only around 5 or 6% behind before, the actual IPC now is down to almost nothing. And this IPC has basically come at an improvement in latencies. There was a lot made about Zen's latencies, and this is where the focus has been, and through that, improving the IPC. Now looking at the new 12nm process and Global Foundries, AMD claims the top clock speeds have been lifted by around 250 MHz. So that's up from 4.1 to 4.35 GHz. This is your turbo, possibly 1 or 2 threads. But they also claim that all core overclocks are now around 4.2 GHz, and also around a 50 mV V-core reduction at any given clock speeds. And again, improved performance per watt. You're either getting 11% lower power draw at the same clock speed, or when looking at the 1700 versus the 2700, you can have an extra 16 performance at the same power. With the takeaway being, 12nm clearly enables higher performance per watt. We see another slide with Cinebench R15 performance, and it's a pretty crushing win in fact for the 2700X over the 8700K. That is a 28% lead. Should be no surprise of course, because we know Ryzen is really great when it comes to Cinebench and rendering in general. There's an even bigger lead of 35% for the 2600X over the 8600K. Remember, the i5 8600K does not have hyperthreading. Now I mentioned Precision Boost 2, and this is where much of the performance uplift has come from. Essentially, this new Precision Boost 2 allows the clock speeds to remain much higher compared to the first generation Ryzen. And here we see one of the main issues with the older Ryzen. Looking at the old 1800X, the original Precision Boost would only allow for 4 GHz on 2 threads, but as soon as the CPU was loaded with 3 threads or more, the clock speed instantly dropped to the base clock, down to 3.7. But Precision Boost 2 is now really quite precise, and if you just follow the orange line, you can imagine that during heavy workloads, the 2700X constantly changes its turbo speed in increments of 25 MHz. You're basically looking at an average uplift of maybe 10% plus here in multi-threaded loads. And AMD says this is down to 12nm, but also an increase in TDP by 10 watts allows for more power to be used more regularly. So that's why the 2700X is a 105 watt TDP CPU compared to the 95 watts of the previous generation 1800X. XFR is now XFR2, the AMD claiming around 7% higher performance again from premium cooling. Now looking at this kind of dark slide, we see 21% faster content creation versus the i7. Your usual stuff, you've got Cinebench, Blender, Handbrake, TrueCrypt and Persistence of Vision Ray. But these next couple are the most interesting ones. 1080p Ultra Gaming, with AMD claiming virtually identical versus the Core i7. Now looking at this, I'm not convinced I would call this virtually identical. The grey bars are generally winning by a small distance in almost every case. A win for the 2700X in the division though, and this was an interesting one, and you'll see why later, but AMD also claiming a very small win in Rise of the Tomb Raider. It looks like a tie in Deus Ex, but everywhere else, it seems clear that the 8700K still has a measure of Ryzen, at least at 1080p Ultra Gaming. Looking at 1440p, definitely a lot tighter there, as you might expect. That looks like a good win for the 2700X in Metro Last Light. Again, we see another small win in Tomb Raider and a very small win in the Division again. One or two bigger wins for the Intel CPUs still though. Stuff like Civilization 6 and F1 2017. Now as you might expect, the 2600X is quite some distance ahead of the 8600K when it comes to content creation. It's a difference between 12 threads and 6 threads. Looking at the gaming performance, AMD is claiming 1 or 2 wins there. Very small win in Overwatch and the Division again. But it's a pretty similar picture to what we saw with the 8700K. Bigger wins for the i5 in Civilization 6 and F1 2017. And at 1440p, no surprises to see, it starts to tighten up a bit. I wonder what's going on there with Metro Last Light at 1440p though. It doesn't seem to be reflected in the 1080p result, but as soon as you move to 1440p, the Ryzen CPUs seem to pull away. Be interesting to see if somebody could verify that one. Moving on, we see the Ryzen 2nd generation has a soldered IHS. Bit of a dig at Intel there. And as we know, they are all multiplier unlocked. They're all overclockable, however this is only really relevant to the non-X CPUs. There we see the Wraith Prism, with AMD again reiterating Socket AM4 has planned support until 2020. Now this one's quite interesting, and it may mean that there won't be a 2800X, because AMD appears to be stacking the 2700X up against the 1800X and the 1700X. These lines here, I guess, probably mean that there will be quad cores coming based on the 2000 series. Now they're also introducing this Store MI technology, with AMD claiming SSD-like performance with hard drive-like capacity, note the star. So I guess it's some kind of caching thing, which should allow for faster loading times and a smoother running system. And a pretty interesting slide showing how it all works. Like most people, your C drive, your operating system, would be stored on a fast solid-state drive. But you might have a larger game library on a slow hard drive. I've actually started doing this now. I've got a 4TB hard drive that I just stick most of my games on. But with AMD's Store MI technology, your hard drive, your SSD and 2GB of your RAM is fused together as one drive letter. And we see there's a learning algorithm which continuously optimizes the block location, and frequently accessed blocks are migrated up to the fastest storage. So that would be like a 2GB RAM drive holding your most accessed games and applications, followed by your SSD, and then finally your hard drive for the stuff you barely look at. It's pretty clever stuff. I'd be quite interested to try that one out actually. And it's free with the X470 motherboards. AMD claims that games load 2.8 times faster using Store MI, with the example used World of Warcraft character select to playable. That's quite a big difference if you were loading from a hard drive. And we also see much faster application launch speeds. So like I said, it's basically all about making what was already pretty good even better. But let's now take a look around the tech press at some of the more interesting articles and benchmarks. Now, one of the great things about not having to get a review out for review day is that you're guaranteed somebody over at Reddit will do all the hard work for you later in compiling the results. And that's exactly what the user Voodoo2SLI did over at AMD's Reddit. And in actual fact, it was over at 3D Center, where this list of websites and benchmarks was first compiled. We've got a compilation of 1% minimum frame rates, so it's not average frame rates, but 1% minimums over 260 benchmarks from 7 launch reviews compiled. And we can see here the usual suspects like AnandTech, Computer Base, PCGH, TechSpot, and we have a bunch of CPUs ranging from the older i7 7700K all the way over to the 2700X. And we're using the i7 8700K as the baseline. And really this is what we're interested in. It's a competition between the 8700K and the 2700X. And right away at the very top, an incredible result over at AnandTech, where they found the 2700X 17.8% faster than the i7 8700K, or I should say 17.8% higher minimum frame rates. But pretty quickly we can see that this appears to be something of a major outlier, as the rest are all kicking around the 90% mark, apart from PCGH, who are actually quite low at below 90%. Now obviously the AnandTech results have been a major talking point, with multiple threads and multiple theories over the past couple of days. And while it's true that AnandTech are very much the standard and have been for many years, and you'll hear me say that time and time again, when you see a result like this and the rest are like this, the prudent course of action is of course to assume there is something not quite right with these results here. Looking at the individual results, it starts off with a great win in Civilization 6, but we see that even the Ryzen 5 2600 is beating the 8700K, and these results were repeated in every single test, with the 4 Ryzen CPUs at the top. Now remember we talked about AMD winning in Tomb Raider, so perhaps no surprise to see this over at AnandTech. Again though, the 4 CPUs at the top, but this was one of the more interesting ones to me. And I did a little bit more digging into this and found another website, hardwarebg.com, the Bulgarian hardware site. I'm obviously not really familiar with them, but their Tomb Raider results line up almost exactly with AnandTech's. We can see here the Ryzen 7 2700X up at 121 frames, with the i7 down at 104. It's actually pretty close to what they got over at AnandTech. Even better result in fact for the Ryzen CPUs. And again we see the 2700X doing pretty well in Civilization 6. Possibly even more interestingly was over at Golem, who are perhaps a better known website, and they found the 2700X was a little bit ahead of the i7 8700K. And these results look a little bit more reasonable to me, as there's not an awful lot in it. But then back over at AnandTech and their Rocket League results, something very strange going on here, as you can see. An 85 frame difference between the 2700X and the 8700K. Ian actually clarified this one on Twitter yesterday. Apparently the game had been updated a lot, and it has known issues with Nvidia drivers not giving parity on AMD and Intel CPUs, and he should have run it on an AMD card. And at the end we see another rather strange result with another win, in a game where AMD rarely wins, Grand Theft Auto 5. Now while this was all ongoing on the Thursday, I started comparing some of Ian's application results to others around the web. AnandTech's Ryzen CPUs were performing as normal, perhaps even slightly below the average, in stuff like Cinebench. So there doesn't appear to be anything at all wrong with the application benchmarks. It just looks like something's gone wrong on the gaming side. There was a lot of talk about AnandTech using the Spectre and Meltdown patches, but it doesn't appear to be anything to do with that. As in actual fact, their most recent 8700K results are pretty much on par with the results pre-patch. So it's got nothing to do with that, it just looks like some kind of systematic error someplace. But Ian's pretty thorough, he'll get to the bottom of it, and I'm pretty sure it'll make for an interesting article when we discover exactly what it is that has gone wrong here. Having been following this from the start, I would say there may be a slight chance of the old Ryzen sleep bug coming back somehow, and that has possibly inflated the new Ryzen 2000 series scores. But like everybody else, we're all just guessing until we get further information. If you want the best gaming CPU, you are going to have to get the 8700K. The reason for that is, of course, very few games scale beyond 6 cores. But of course there are one or two other use cases for the R7s and their 8 cores. And you'll see one advantage of those extra cores pretty soon in this video. But first of all, a message from Tiny Tom Logan over at OC3D TV.
Now what you do need to keep in mind is this is my specific CPU. I got it from AMD. It actually been tested by AMD as well, because when we got it, it was covered in thermal paste. So we know that they'd done a cherry pick on it anyway. 4.2 stable seems to be about where most people are going to be getting, or at least the ones that I've seen gone out. We pushed past that. Now this board did manage to get 4.275 stable at around 1.5 volts, which we did then bench at for the overclock tests.
So AMD have cherry-picked a Ryzen 7 2700X and sent it to Tom still with the thermal paste on top. I don't even know where to start with this stuff, AMD. I mean, come on. Given all the stuff that I've been talking about recently on the channel, that is pretty mind-boggling stuff, AMD. And as you heard there, 4.2 GHz is about the highest stable overclock that anybody else was getting. Tom's did 4.275, so you can see that there really does appear to be a point there where the vast majority of these CPUs are going to fall off a cliff. If the press is getting 4.2, then don't be surprised if 4.1 is actually the average overclock for these, which is pretty disappointing stuff, it has to be said, from the new 12nm process and 1.528 volts. I don't think I'd want to run that through the CPU for any length of time. What most in the press found was it's basically pointless even overclocking these X CPUs. Just let Precision Boost 2 do its job. You'll get that 4.3 GHz single thread speed, and Precision Boost 2 will take care of the multi-threaded score. Honestly, don't bother even overclocking these ones. You'd only consider overclocking the non-X CPUs. But as I said, looking at the price differences, I think now the X CPUs are the ones to get instead. Now this is supposed to be a review of reviews, but to be frank, the more reviews I looked at, the more it became much of a muchness. An awful lot of the press is just kind of following their same formula now, and we see an awful lot of the same benchmarks benched over and over. It does tend to mean that you read one, you've read them all. There are of course always one or two exceptions, and once again Computer Base have gone that extra mile. Ryzen 2700X on steroids, and what they've done is they've benchmarked with DDR4 3466 and sharp timings. When looking at the difference in latencies, that is pretty impressive stuff. From the stock 2933, that would be 72.2 nanoseconds, that is down to 60.7 nanoseconds with DDR4 3466 and their optimized timings. Interesting to note that for Intel CPUs, the same kind of tuning doesn't really bring that much in terms of performance, but that is a pretty decent looking increase with the Ryzen 7 2700X. So much so that with the optimized timings and 3466 memory, their 2700X now surpasses a stock 8700K, and we see a bunch of benchmarks with the effect as well. A very nice uplift in Assassin's Creed Origins. That's pretty hefty looking uplift in Far Cry 5 as well, and we see the story repeated over and over. That one's a bit of an eye-opener as well. And the final one with Total War Warhammer, that is an incredible uplift, simply from better timings. Now I will say that some of these just look a little bit too good to be true, so it would be nice if somebody else in the press could verify these results, or at least do their own testing and see what kind of results they get. We know that Ryzen responds very well to memory and memory timings. It would be great to see just how far this could be pushed, and we can wonder at what may happen in future with even faster memory. But this was certainly one of the more interesting articles, and well worth checking out. Now, as I said, there are cases where the R7's 8 cores, 16 threads, are an advantage over the i7 8700K, even in gaming, or more accurately, while gaming and streaming. If you recall back to my 1800X review last year, I actually covered gaming and streaming, or gaming and recording, and I showed how the 1800X was able to record at higher quality than the i7 7700K, and I used Fallout 4 as an example. Now, even though the i7 7700K had a higher frame rate while playing, the actual recording was an unwatchable stutterfest. The 1800X had a lower frame rate for me, but the quality and smoothness of the video was by far and away superior to the 7700K. Now, Steve over at Gamers Nexus did a similar test comparing the 2700X, this time up against the i7 8700K. Now, this should be a much closer battle because the 8700K does of course have 6 cores and 12 threads. So while the 1800X had double the cores and threads, 2700X doesn't have that much of an advantage. And Steve started off by streaming PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, very popular game obviously, and one that runs kinda crap on all AMD hardware. And he started off with the streamer side FPS. So basically this was Steve's own experience while playing through the game. The 2700X doesn't look that far behind the 8700K here in average FPS, however that's a 141 frame limiter on the 8700K, or it would be much higher. But we can see as Steve starts streaming, depending on the streaming settings, obviously the average frame rate starts to drop, as you're asking the CPU, and the entire system in fact, to do an awful lot more. The 8700K appears to hang in quite well there, even when streaming at 12 megabits per second and a medium preset, which is actually pretty high quality for a stream. The 2700X maybe doesn't do quite so well, especially at the 12 megabits per second. That 83 average, you're seeing just a few too many dips there below 60. But what was more interesting was what happened viewer side. It's all well and good having the streamer get a nice playable experience, but if the viewer's seeing a stuttery mess, then that's no good whatsoever. And in actual fact, the higher you put the settings, the more the 8700K started to struggle. Now, it has to be said that these are pretty high settings already. 10 megabits per second is higher than most streamers are streaming at. But a lot of that is to do with the fact that streamers lack the hardware to stream at higher quality. But as we can see, both the 2700X and 8700K, they do pretty well at 10 megabits per second and the faster preset. When you move to 12 megabits per second and the medium preset, 2700X is doing pretty okay still. It's encoding most of the frames, but it is dropping some there. The 8700K though, at 12 megabits per second and medium, it can no longer encode the vast majority of those frames. Interesting to see though, 5 GHz overclock, and it does manage to get a lot more of those frames out. Now that was PlayerUnknown's, as I said. We see a very similar story again in Dota 2. The 8700K gives a smoother experience gaming and streaming for the streamer. But once again, once you move to the medium preset, we basically see the exact same story. Now to be fair, and to repeat what I said, this kind of is an engineered benchmark, but it's interesting all the same. The reality here is most streamers would stick to the faster preset and probably 10 megabits per second, where we can see the 2700X does still perform that little bit better than the 8700K. But perhaps what's more important here, if you stream a game that naturally uses more cores, then even at this 10 megabits per second faster preset, the 8700K will start to fall away down to like what we see here with the medium preset. So over time, as more games use more cores, you maybe just find that your 2700X is a better streaming CPU than the 8700K. If not when it comes to your own frame rate, then it would be when it comes to your viewers' experience. And obviously, as a streamer, this one is by far and away the most important. And another reason why I used this benchmark was because of this.
Crazy that with a Threadripper in 1080 Ti, I could still drop 40 or 50 frames while even looking at cities in the distance not being in them. I think they've made great strides, but still have a long way to go. Threadripper lol. There's your problem, man. You never go AMD.
Where the fuck I am.
For anything in life. Surprised people still buy them. I mean, they're cheap and affordable, I guess. Listen, there's a reason why they're so cheap, alright?
Threadripper lol, there's your problem man, never go AMD. Unless of course you're streaming PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds and don't want to spend maybe $1,000 on a really high-end CPU or a second PC. Something like a Threadripper 1950X will have absolutely no problems whatsoever crunching any game at medium and a high bitrate. And generally speaking, that's why I would take my tech advice from tech guys, but by all means ask guys like Shroud for tips on PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. But that's pretty much it for the Ryzen reviews. Check out Jay's non-review. Apparently he trashed his SSD and was unable to do his review as a result of that. But wrapping this one up, there's been absolutely no surprises at all. The expectation here was the 2700X would come in a little bit faster than the 1800X. I have to say I am not hugely impressed by the 12nm node. It looks pretty weak to me in fact. And a top end of another 250 MHz on a single core it looks. Not exactly blown away by that. But 10% was what we were told to expect, and I guess it's maybe around about that. Just about. All the latency stuff, that's pretty interesting, but overall AMD have claimed 3% IPC. I mean 3% IPC, I don't want to be too harsh on them, because Intel of course gave us 0% IPC over the past 3 years. That's what we've had from Skylake to Kaby Lake to Coffee Lake. Absolutely no IPC uplift. So by that yardstick, 3% looks absolutely fantastic, but I am still disappointed with that because it looks pretty low effort to me. And as I said in my video, Ryzen 2000 series leaked a minor disappointment. It does appear that AMD have basically stopped working on the core maybe 6 months ago, and then moved everybody on to Zen 2. This is just typical AMD, moving on to the next big thing when they were already in a great fight. You know, when I look back at how AMD improved Piledriver over the original Bulldozer, there was a lot of changes in there. There was obviously a lot of low-hanging fruit. And my expectation was that Zen also would have had a lot of low-hanging fruit. As it is, you've got 3% IPC from latency improvements, and not an awful lot more. The really big improvement has come from Precision Boost 2, the ability to hold higher clock speeds on multiple threads, but that was more of a weakness of the original Zen architecture. This is the sort of thing that we should have seen in Zen 1, so I consider that really as a fix rather than any great improvement. But I also said in this video, the leaked prices on these slides, it didn't look competitive against the Intel CPUs. Since then they've clearly decided to drop the prices. Another $30-40 or so on the 2700X, and that now looks like a pretty decent CPU. There's no question though, it is nowhere near what we had last year, where AMD had the overwhelming core and thread counts over those quad-core i7s. Now that Coffee Lake's out there, they're in a real fight, and you've got to say that even that i5 8600K, even though it only has the 6 cores and doesn't have hyper-threading, it's still a pretty decent gaming CPU. It's a pretty tough comparison there with the 2600X and 2600. Whichever one you go for really just does depend on you. The fact is we're still talking 1080p gaming here. Most guys with these CPUs now are probably looking at 1440p results. You're talking at most a 5% difference in performance. The Intel CPUs are still ahead in gaming, there's no question about that. But if you're doing anything else on top of that, maybe streaming, rendering video, anything at all, or if you just want to save a bit of money and get a decent cooler, then the Ryzen CPUs are still great CPUs. Disappointingly good is how I would sum up the Ryzen 2000 series, but that is more likely a reflection of the high standards that I hold all of these guys to, whether it's AMD, Intel, or Nvidia. That's me done with this one. As always, there'll be a bunch of links in the description below. I'm going to have to update my Amazon links with all these new Ryzen CPUs, so I'll get around to updating that at some point. But I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later, guys.